is a UT professor of history. We really think of him as the UT professor of history. And he has acted as our guest curator for this show, which we think is the most important we have done in the history of the museum, which is saying quite a bit. His degrees are from Georgetown undergraduate, and then he went on to the University of Connecticut for his master's and his PhD. Booker T. Washington at the Tampa Bay Casino has brought in so many people already, and we just opened last month. Our press has been terrific. But you will have until December to see it because it's a 9-month show. Dale wanted me to mention just briefly about the casino, which Charles is going to talk about later also. We like to reinforce this. The casino was Tampa's first performing arts center. It was never for gambling, ever. And casino was simply a word for performing arts in that era. It was, it seated 2,000 people. It was a grand, wonderful building, and Charles will speak on that. I think it's important to acknowledge our underwriters. We could do nothing without them. And the underwriters for this show are the Oxford Exchange, the law firm of Ogletree Deakins, the Tampa Bay Lightning, Downtown Rotary, the Bank of Tampa, the Go-Beyond Foundation, the Museum Society, Tampa Electric, and Ori Byers and Steve Richards. Before I turn it over to Charles, I wanted to recognize and thank Susan Carter, who is our permanent curator registrar. Susan, raise your hand. And she has worked alongside Charles for, they probably feel that it's years, I think it's been months, but they've really done a terrific job. And I also want to recognize 2 of our Board of Trustees members of the museum. Sandy Reed is here, and Kathy Gurdon is in the back row. I think that's all I have. I will turn it over now to Charles.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about this exhibit. We do think it is very special, and I hope you will come, and I hope that you will tell everybody else to come as well. As Cynthia said, it will be open until December. So let me just dive into this right away. If you've been to the museum, and hopefully you have, you might have noticed that there's a photograph of Booker T. Washington in the sports and amusements room of the museum, but there's no story attached to it. And it's there next to a photograph of the Tampa Bay Casino. Now, when I see a picture of a famous person and I'm in a place that used to be a hotel, my first thought is, oh, they slept here. But of course he didn't, because you had to be white to stay at the Tampa Bay Hotel, which already tells us that there's a different story. And that really became our research question. We're very fortunate that the Library of Congress, which administers Booker T. Washington's papers in Washington, D.C., actually had extensive documentation on his time in Tampa, and also on the African American community members who were responsible for the local arrangements. It was the Florida branch of the National Negro Business League that administered his entire tour through Florida in 1912, but there was no local arrangements committee specifically for Tampa. And so it brought to the forefront some people who otherwise might not be remembered locally. And in and of itself, I think that's such an important thing. And then as we started digging into the story, there were 2 things that were very clear. This was a time where segregation was formalizing in Tampa and becoming quite rigid. And so that very dramatically shaped what this visit was going to look like. And then what we also see by focusing on the community members who participated in organizing this visit, that the community had a lot of responses to the formalization of segregation in terms of the building of their own institutions. And so, as part of a continuing conversation about our community, where we've been, where we are, what we need to do to move forward together, I think both of those stories are very important. So you have a photograph here. Maybe you can come up at a later point and take a look. But these are members of Booker T. Washington's party. They're kind of fascinated by this orange grove, as I would be if I were coming into the state. And they included a lot of very well-known people in the African American community nationally. I'm always really attracted to, there's a young Alan Rock here who goes on to be one of the leaders of the Harlem Renaissance, the New Negro movement in which it's situated. But so they essentially traveled around Florida. And they had to travel in a private car because, of course, segregation laws prevented African Americans from purchasing first-class train tickets. So in order to have reasonable accommodation traveling through the state, they really needed to make this special arrangement, which of course depended on actually being able to get a donor essentially to run that car. So in any case, the requirements of travel also meant they had to stay someplace. And so they depended on African American community members in each of their stops. And so you're looking here at a picture of Reverend Perrin, who was actually, he was an elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He had been actually the rector of St. Paul's. And he actually hosted Washington while he was in Tampa. There were other community members that hosted the rest of the party. So you see a picture of the casino here, which no longer is standing on what is now the university campus. And the community members made a decision to use this space, which by this point in time was owned by the city, to host Washington's visit. And I think in doing so, they were laying claim to space in the city at a time where they were very much being pushed out. The ramifications, as you can read about in the exhibit companion, was that they had to adhere to very strict segregation. So whites had to buy tickets in one location, African Americans bought tickets in another location. It was a segregated theater. And the casino staff went so far as to actually put sheeting down the aisle of the theater, which Booker T. Washington required to have removed before he would actually speak. So you get a clear sense of what life was like in Tampa at this moment. I have some pictures I'll just show you very briefly of some folks that I think are useful to consider. So this is an advertisement for the Williams Cigar Company. J. Andrew Williams was a black businessman in Tampa who actually owned a cigar factory. And Washington was very impressed with him, and in fact invited him to come and speak that summer at the national meeting of the National Negro Business, National Negro Business League. As somebody who really kind of represented what Washington saw as the path to success with business ownership. Again, he housed part of the party. He also provided cigars at the reception. The reception was held in Ybor City. And we know, this is something that has been known for a long time, that part of the reason for that was essentially segregation, where the people congregated. What we actually found in the papers was that the Martí Maceo Society, which was the Afro-Cuban organization that had recently been formed, partly as a result of segregation, having to break off from a larger Cuban organization, they actually helped host this event. And so it shows a very early example of building links between the African American and Afro-Cuban communities in Tampa, which I thought was a really exciting discovery. And then finally, just to show you one more, I have an image here of Joe B. Williams. Was very, very fortunate. These two individuals are not related, by the way, but I had the great pleasure of actually doing an oral history with a descendant of J. Andrew Williams, and he provided some of the photographs for the exhibit, including this photograph of Gerald B. Williams, who was the president of the Phyllis Wheatley Art Club, which is a black women's organization. Again, one of these organizations that really kind of stepped up to provide services for African Americans as they were deprived of a number of public services. And then the very last thing that I'll show you, because I just think it's a really useful connection, and we can open it up for question and answer, is we also profile in the exhibit Washington's path to national prominence, focusing specifically on this very famous speech that he gave, the Atlanta Compromise speech at the Atlanta Exposition in 1895. And one of the things that really fascinated us about this is that Henry Plant was also figured very prominently at the exposition. And so there's a very interesting connection, which is the organizers of the exposition who are trying to promote Southern industry are very much trying to sell to Northern manufacturers the idea that race relations in the South have improved. And part of that, of course, was inviting Booker T. Washington to come and give this speech, where he becomes very famous as a result. But Henry Plant was basically promoted as somebody who was a successful employer of African Americans, right? And so again, kind of trying to build this image of the South. And then, of course, by the time that he comes here, what we see is really kind of the deterioration of race relations in the city as segregation boundaries are hardened. And so I think some of that promise that was advertised earlier has not come into existence. So I think there's so many wonderful things that we can engage as topics, important things. And so I would invite your questions. Thank you so much.